Welcome to Quakecast, the podcast for id Software's classic Quake and the games it inspired.
Hello, Quakers, and welcome to another episode of the Quakecast. On this episode, we have invited Ivar Hill to discuss his in-development indie shooter Core Decay. Core Decay is inspired by games like Descent, Deus Ex, and the System Shock series. And it's going to have puzzles and, combat and storytelling. We're going to get into all of that and how the project came about in just a second. But before we begin, I just want to remind everybody these are really difficult times for all of us during this pandemic. And I just want to wish you all good health and please take care of yourself and follow the protocols that we've all been reminded about in the last few days and weeks. So all my best to you and yours. And just take about a 45-minute distraction here with Ivar Hill on the Quakecast.
Well, so I started PC gaming really quite early. I grew up with PCs and a Mac, but just in general, I had a lot of computers in general. I was very computer interested. So basically all of my childhood was PC gaming. I never had any consoles. I never had any Nintendo systems or anything like that. So it was basically all I had. Some of the earliest games that I played and enjoyed were games like Descent or Age of Empires. The real classics like Doom and Quake came a bit later, but just in general, old PC games, old Windows and DOS games. And I think that's basically as soon as I started playing PC games, I also started trying to mod them or trying to create my own content for them. I don't know exactly why. I think it just felt really rewarding to me. I think the first stuff I did was maps for Age of Empires and things like that, which was of course pretty straightforward, but it starts you going on that sort of track. And I've basically been doing game development ever since. I got an education in it reasonably early, and I've been working in the game industry for a number of years. So I don't know, it kind of always felt like what I wanted to be doing.
So you hail from Sweden. What was your education like there as far as the gaming stuff? Was it a university program or is it some other kind of outlet to learn that skill?
Yeah. So Sweden, the educational system works a little bit differently. Once you graduate high school, which is a little bit before you do so in the US, you go to what's commonly called an upper secondary school, which is basically an in-between of high school and university, where you sort of choose a focus of what you want to do. So I went on a 3-year course at that stage, which was officially called digital production. And that was things like 3D modeling and overall computing skills. And after that, I went to a 2-year trade school, which was specifically targeting game development. And I'm mostly focused on art, but trade school's still the kind of experience where you put your theory into practice a lot. So I got to experience, a lot of facets of game development. And after that, I basically went into the industry.
Yeah, it seems like you got a really good foundation because, I've noted on your website and kind of your career stuff is that you do music, you do programming, you do asset creation, 3D asset creation. So it's really impressive. You're 27, so your mind is nimble, but the body, the actual experience you've had is super impressive. And so you're at Mad Otter. Is that the studio that you're at?
That is correct.
Yeah. So you're in the mobile space there, and but you're working on Core Decay, and that's what we're going to talk about today at length. So tell me how your education kind of led you to go ahead and take the jump into making your own game, side project, no time limit, that kind of thing. Was that always the plan, or was it sort of something that grew out of, your time in the industry?
Well, Core Decay specifically wasn't necessarily always the plan. That was an idea that slowly came to be over the last 4 years or so. I did always know I wanted to do some kind of project like this. I think my long-term plan has always been to have my own studio, even if it's just me or even if it's just a few people. I've always wanted to be handling all these aspects of game development and sort of do my own thing. So I enjoy my job and I do a lot of interesting things in there. But long term, I've always felt like, I want to try out doing this sort of thing entirely on my own. So I think Core Decay came from there. as something that I could have an outlet for that, because it's very different, right? Like when you work at a game studio, you do a lot of things that are more focused, and a lot of things that are, I mean, it's just a different experience. So it doesn't really replace it. It just adds to it. But definitely, I always want to do something, and Core Decay to me is sort of a celebration of the experiences that I had growing up, and I think a lot of people did, and still sort of it's a slightly different take on the old school shooters than I think we've seen a lot in the last few years, but we will probably get more into that later.
Yeah, that's one of the things that caught my attention. So before we get into Core Decay, let me just ask you something I'm curious about. What is, because you're, I don't want to say you're a generalist, but you're multifaceted, you're multi-talented. So what is your favorite aspect of, of creating your own game? What's the thing you look forward to?
Yeah, I mean, I would probably consider myself a generalist, in that sense. I think so I feel there is one key moment where you have built all of these independent parts and it finally comes together into something that sort of represents a game. And it's that shift that I do find really, really rewarding. So it's like you've done art, you've done some coding, you've done some music, and it's all been this self-contained individual things. But just that act of taking all of these individual components and then you bring them together into one cohesive experience, that I think is what feels the most rewarding in general. Aside from that, so my formal education is in art, and that's always what I've been doing the most. So that's definitely probably, if I had to pick one specific aspect of game development, that's probably still what I find the most interesting.
Yeah, I was going to say you probably don't have this issue that called programmer art, where you have
Yep.
this ugly, ugly
Oh
stuff.
no, see, I have the opposite issue, where I really feel like everything I put out there has to be as polished as possible. So even though you really only want the placeholder, that can be really hard for me to do.
Mhm. Well, cool. So let's get into Core Decay, and to me, this feels like I've done a little research since the last time we chatted online, and to me, I keep coming back to this term, thinking man shooter. I don't know if that's an insult or if it's
No,
more
no,
accurate.
I think that makes sense. So I've always the core idea, and that's not a pun, has always
Sure.
been uh, the core idea of this game has been to make a game that plays like an old school shooter, but that has immersive sim elements to it. In other words, it pulls from games like Deus Ex, from games like System Shock, and so on. Uh, but still more in the retro shooter foundation, so to speak. And I know it's interesting because I don't know if you noticed, so the game got an article in PC Gamer a couple of weeks ago where they talked about it briefly.
No, I didn't. That's great.
Yeah, no, I was really happy to see it. I was pleasantly surprised. I hadn't expected coverage quite so soon, but obviously that's great to hear and to see. But anyway, so it got coverage in PC Gamer, and the way they described it was, I mean, it was great, but it sort of made it seem like it was essentially a reimagining of a game like Deus Ex, which I mean, I'd love to do that.
Yeah, I was
Which
going to say, I
I
don't
mean,
know, one
it's
person
my
team at that point.
yeah, I mean, it's Deus Ex is my favorite game of all time, hands down by far, the original. But I mean, yeah, it's you can't make a game like that with a team of one, and that's not really ever been the goal. I think it's more about having a game that plays more like a classic shooter, and that's also way more viable to do with a small team, but then sort of pull elements from games like that into it, like the focus on exploration and the way the storyline is presented, and the somewhat slower pace in some regards, I think comes from that.
I got to say, as being someone who's, 52 years old, I actually kind of welcome that. I would prefer that now. I think I was playing. I won't say the game I was playing last night, but I was playing something after I had worked a side gig at home yesterday, and I was playing this fast action game that anybody who listens to Quakecast would recognize the title. But anyway, I was playing the game and I was getting really frustrated because I was just getting my ass kicked and handed to me, and I'm like, I just want to walk around and check stuff out, and I don't want this adrenaline. I'm going to have a heart attack.
Yeah,
so
no,
actually, so Core Decay sounds really right up my alley at this point in my life.
and of course, I mean, it's not one or the other. And just to be clear, it's not a slow paced game in the sense that Deus Ex is a slow paced game, right? I mean, there is still action, there is still fast paced combat, I think the difference is more about what role the combat plays in the context of the game as a whole. Like if you look at Doom, if you look at Quake, Unreal to some degree, and so on, uh, the combat is self-serving, right? It's the combat is there for its own benefit, right? The game is about the combat. They make it really good, and it's that's not a bad thing, right? I mean, these games have fantastic combat. However, I feel like in Core Decay, the combat exists more to serve the gameplay of exploring the level as a whole. So it's a tool where it's like, you know that in the next room there might be a combat encounter, and rather than just running in without any consideration, as you would in, well, say Doom, which again in that game is a good thing. In this case, it's more about, okay, is it worth checking that out? Might they lose out on valuable health or ammunition? So it's like the combat itself can certainly be fast paced, and that's also something I think some people somewhat misinterpreted a little bit, where it's like it's not a slow paced game in that sense, but you kind of have to think twice, and it's more about the large scale conservation of resources and strategic planning than it is about the moment to moment combat encounters.
So tell us a little bit about the storyline in the game, because it's such it's a story driven game, and your trailer has some really great voice acting. Tell us about the story, and then maybe get into how the story is going to be presented in the game.
So the game takes place in the near future, where Earth and civilization has begun to collapse. There are environmental disasters. Governments are breaking down. Corporations are essentially consolidating their power and becoming the driving factor. And in the midst of this terrible environmental disaster, we have this core small group of conspirators who are fast determined to ensure humanity's survival no matter what. And as the player character, you essentially wake up in one of the facilities belonging to this group of conspirators. You have no idea how you got there. You have no idea what's going on. And the game itself, the storyline of the game as a whole, is all about establishing, well, what is actually the state of Earth? Who are these people? What are they trying to do? You know that you learn early on they have a plan, right? So they want to ensure that we all survive this terrible disaster and this terrible state we're in, but you don't know what they're planning and you don't know how bad it's going to be. And so the game as a whole is really just a journey of exploration and understanding what is actually going on, right? So it's the second part of your question is interesting, right? Like how this is conveyed, because
Mhm.
that's something I've been I won't say struggling with, but it's a tricky thing, right? Like in a game like this, like I can have voice acting. I can and will have voice acting. But what I can't have is expansive, technically way out there cutscenes and things like that, right?
Mhm. Right.
I can't have cinematics. I can't have high budget pre-rendered cutscenes, anything like that. It's just beyond the scope of this sort of project. But it's not necessarily a bad thing. So once again, I find it's easy to look out to old school games and classic games for inspiration. And you look at a game like, well, you look at a game like, say, Unreal, which has a lot of logs you find,
Mhm.
and you look at a game like Deus Ex, which has a ton of logs you find, where a lot of the story is conveyed not necessarily through talking to people, but just walking around and finding these remnants of the people who came before you. And that's something I'm leaning into really heavily. I have a lot of like a large chunk of this entire storyline is presented through finding data logs and records and conversations as you explore the levels, right?
Mhm.
And that serves a few purposes. One is it makes exploring the levels interesting. Right? The other one is, as someone who is not a writer by trade, I find it a lot easier to convey events and a story and a narrative through things like records of people having conversations and things like that, because it's an easier context in which you write dialogue, right? So rather than having to write a lot of like full on character dialogue, I can more easily do things like, records of email conversations and records of notes that people have taken and so on. So a lot of the story is presented through these fragments of records you find throughout the level. And to complement that, I do also have a dialogue system where you get hailed on a comlink device. And this is fully optional, by the way, but you get hailed on a comlink device and you have people talk to you that are voice acted, and you have branch dialogues. You get to say, you get to choose what to respond, and you get to basically, the idea is for you to engage as much with the story as you want to, right? So if you're completely uninterested in the story altogether, you can just ignore these things entirely and not even care about them. If you're a little bit interested, you can actually partake in these dialogue trees, and you can talk to NPCs or to characters, and basically just ask the core things you're interested in. And if you really want to delve into the storyline, you can exhaust every single option possible. So it's sort of an RPG element, but it's one that I think works really well because the last thing I want to do is to force players to get exposed to a narrative they're not interested in, right?
Right. Yeah. A lot of people get kind of cheesed when there's a cutscene. Like I know Kojima games, are super popular, but that's one of my turnoffs is the long cutscenes. Like I want to play the game, I don't want to watch a movie. I'd
Yeah,
watch a movie if I want to watch a movie, but still brilliant games, obviously.
right.
That sounds really refreshing that you have the log system that's like a System Shock and kind of a Doom 3 thing. I actually enjoyed that in Doom 3, because you have this intense combat and crazy stuff, and then you kind of do the hunt and find these recordings and they were part of the gameplay a lot of times, unlocking, chests and things like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, I was gonna say that because that's something I do a lot as well. It's not just disconnected narrative. It could also be something like, you find a log and it's an email from someone saying like, we really got to change the password from this from Sarah, 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 because this is ridiculous. And you read it and you see that. And so obviously there is a container or something nearby your door, and you've read that, so you know to try that code. So, there are things like that all over the place.
Right. That sounds great. Now let's talk about the visuals. You definitely have the kind of Gibson-esque, Blade Runner-esque visual, storytelling going on. It's beautiful. And it's funny that I have a little tiny bit of experience with the Unreal Engine and a little tiny bit of experience with Unity. And it's kind of funny how you can, after a while, you can pick out what engine it is.
Right.
And this is not a slight at all. And you can certainly do the same thing on Unreal. But my curiosity would be, okay, so why Unity? I think I know the answer, by the way. But why Unity? And then let's talk about the visual style.
Well, so there are actually a couple of reasons that I went with Unity. One is I had some previous experience in it.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a number of years of basically just knowing how to use it. And when you have past experience and you're going to embark on a solo project, well, it's been a solo project. It really helps to have tools you already know, right? The second is I find that Unity is a really useful engine for generalists development. In other words, it's really, really flexible in that it's not really built for one specific purpose, and it's extremely modular. So I've always found that Unity is an engine that it's really, really fast to prototype in. So it's really easy to work in when you're the one responsible for designing and creating all of these interwoven systems. I find it's an engine that makes it really easy to prototype all of that really quickly and make sure it all fits together and then gradually refine it. And the workflow itself, I feel works really well for smaller projects as opposed to, the Unreal Engine or CryEngine or what have you, which are great engines, but they require more time and more work to prototype mechanics. I feel at least it's been a few years since I used these engines, but back when I did, that was my impression. The third reason, which apparently there's a third reason, multi-platform, which is a
Right.
big one, because Unity makes it extremely easy to publish to PC, Mac, Linux, as well as mobile. Which I am. I'm also doing a mobile port of the game simultaneously.
Right. That's what I was
Yeah,
hinting at.
I figured that's what you were thinking of.
Yeah.
And that makes it extremely easy to do that. Like really, in terms of mobile, the only challenges are design considerations, where how do you control and performance considerations. But apart from that, it just works, which is really nice.
That's great. Yeah, I noticed on your Discord that you were talking about like a Nexus 7 and the game's running at 30 frames per
Yep.
second. So, yeah, that's super encouraging. This retro kind of renaissance that we have right now really helps with, getting the game out to more platforms than you would normally do. So I think it's a great trend. And I mean, just looking at the trailer and the screenshots and everything, it is really impressive what you've done. And then just translate that into a mobile game. I think it's going to be something really special, especially with the gameplay mechanics, having like a System Shock on your phone.
Yeah,
kind
and
of thing.
obviously, as you can imagine, there has been a lot of people in the more traditionalist PC crowd or desktop crowd they've brought up as like, why are you doing this on mobile? That's ridiculous. But mobile gaming gets a bad rap, especially from people who don't do it right. To people who only play on PC or consoles or whatnot. But really, to me, it has nothing to do with the platform. I mean, yeah, there might not be a lot of games that are the kind of games you want to play currently available on mobile, but that's really a problem of the availability of the games and less so with what the mobile platform can do. So I found it's an important part of the development for me of this project to basically use it to show that really you can have an old school shooter on a phone or a tablet and it will play the same as you would in a PC. You don't have to design it with more modern mobile design considerations in the way that people think you do.
Now, do you feel like basically the builds are going to be separate builds, or are they going to be? Is it going to be pretty much one to one, except for the control scheme?
Yeah, it's essentially the same build. I mean, they're separate builds from a technical standpoint, but
Hmm.
the game code base and the game itself is identical. Like I can boot up the PC version, I can check a toggle in the settings, and now I play the mobile version essentially.
Right, right. Okay, I just want to
So
make sure that
yeah, I'm,
yeah,
I'm building
they're
everything
basically
completely seamless, so I can just switch between. So obviously, mobile will have different controls and the different UI elements, right?
mhm.
And some stuff like shader tech will be a little bit more limited as you compile and whatnot. But aside from that, really, it is the same game. And it has a lot of advantages too. For instance, if you were to play the game on a tablet and you plug in a keyboard and mouse, which you can do,
Mhm.
or at the very least a keyboard, you can play literally the PC controls with no issues
Nice.
whatsoever, right? Because
That's nice.
you don't have to do any work for that. It just works because it's all the same. So that's really nice. And also, it's important because you need to test with different controls constantly, right? So
Mhm.
it makes it a lot easier. Um, so yeah, it's essentially it's the same game. There isn't really a PC and mobile separate version entirely. I'm building one game. I'm making it work as well as possible, and then I'm just making tweaks per platform. I seem to be kind of 50-50 on whether I test on mobile or PC in terms of the control scheme. But I think that's good. Like you really want to optimize for both. Needless to say, mobile is the harder one.
Right. I would imagine, especially because there's all the variants in the hardware. Even though Android on paper or the promise was like, oh, it's all fine. No, it's basically like supporting a bajillion different PCs. I would imagine, right?
Yeah, which I mean, to be fair, you can say that about PCs too, right?
Right.
Uh,
Of course. Yeah.
but the ceiling, I mean, people do have more powerful PCs than they do phones a lot of the time. I mean, the crowd who finds this game and they find it interesting,
Mhm.
they're more likely to have a PC that can easily handle it than necessarily. I mean, if they have a mid-end phone that is 5 years old, it might not hit 60 frames, but that's okay.
So not only do you code, not only do you make art assets and 3D animation and all that, you're also doing music, right? So now is that music in the trailer yours?
Yeah, yeah, I
That's
that's
great.
mine.
This
Yeah, I
had a
composed that one.
great feel. Had a great feel. I loved it.
Yeah, so far I've been composing all of the music from scratch used in the game. I don't intend to use this in the final game. It's been more conceptual, more to find the mood. And as of a week ago or so, I have pulled a professional composer into the project, so I'm excited to see where that goes. I do enjoy writing music, but it's not my profession. I don't have an education revolving around it, so I can make stuff that's okay. I can't make stuff that I think is great or that is like technically fantastic. So I'm really really happy to be able to have gotten an actual composer involved as of really recently.
So let's talk about the team. You were a one man show for quite a while, and now you have a pretty great little team, including Serge, who's
Yep.
part of the Doom and Quake and Unreal communities. His name is all over the place. So talk about your team building here.
Yeah, it's been pretty sporadic. I feel like it was always developed with this idea, the game overall, that if this ended up being a solo project all the way through, that would be fine. And if it was to expand to a larger team, that would be fine too, right? So a couple months ago, Serge actually he reached out to me and said, "Hey, would you be interested in collaborating? I can help out with this." And and it kind of started from there. And he joined the project overall. And after that, I've been trying to make it really clear that this is this is a hobby project, right? It's a passion project. It's both my work and the work of everyone else on the team. It's on a purely contributing basis, right? So we don't really have a sense of strict deadlines or specific amounts of work that has to be made or anything like that. Like I'm still trying to run it like a hobbyist solo project in that sense, because I don't want, I mean, everyone who's working on this, me included, we have jobs, we have hobbies, we have things we do in our spare time. So everything is sort of set up with that in mind. So everyone who is contributing to it is doing so sort of on a basis of when there is spare time. And I mean, Serge has been doing an amazing job at this so far. So I'm really happy to see that. And him aside, I do have a few other people on the project. One guy is helping out with coding, one's with art, and it's fairly small scale so far. But I'm excited to see how much that can be expanded and sort of ramp up the scale of the collaboration.
Yeah, and I think just getting more press, like the PC Gamer article or the thing on PC Gamer, it can't hurt, right? So
No,
yeah,
certainly not.
and I'm kind of involved with a similar project right now, and I know it's just so tough. I feel like I get so overwhelmed with all the things, all the things I have going, right? And so how do you keep from becoming overwhelmed? I mean, are you good with scheduling? You're like, okay, on Saturday I'm going to spend 2 hours on Core Decay, and then I'm going to have a life and do chores and things like that. How do you handle it, or is it just constant chaos when you're doing this stuff?
Yeah, it is tricky. I mean, in the past 2 years that it was entirely a solo project, I think my strategy was never to prioritize it over family life and work and anything like that.
Mhm.
So, there were periods of weeks or even like a couple months at one point where I just didn't work on the game at all. But that was mostly intentional, where I wanted to make sure that I didn't work on it at the expense of, other important things in my life. And I think through time, this project has turned from a small side thing to something that is in its own right an important part of my life. So with that, I definitely have moved on to more, as you say, more intentional scheduling in that sense, where I do indeed say, well, this weekend, I have this many hours. I should probably spend this many hours on working on the game. Honestly, the main challenge isn't scheduling or getting work done. It's this idea that there is an insurmountable amount of work still ahead, right? And I think that's always I think that's always the case for games. And it just has to be one of those you do it one step at a time. But that's definitely the biggest challenge, especially when I'm doing, and I still am doing, like the vast majority of all of the disciplines involved myself. So I can spend weeks doing nothing but a few 3D models and textures, right?
Mhm.
And that's great, but then you realize that, okay, that's a tiny part of the whole game. So then you move on to, okay, maybe I should be coding for a little while. But it just, these things, they take a lot of time. And I think my way of working around it is just accepting that and feeling like, okay, there might be a while before this game sees, a beta, which is why I've been generous and said, I'm aiming for this year. Uh,
Mhm.
but really, I never want development to completely take over my life or the life of anyone else involved. So it is at the expense of just a longer development cycle. But I think that is a reasonable call to make.
Right. Now, when would you think, and I want to put pressure on you, but when would you think that developer was stretching on for too long? Because there are teams that, spend 5 years on a game, and then there's a couple, games that are made in a couple months, So when would you feel uncomfortable? I know you have beta 2020 as the goal. And I'm assuming it'll be like early access on Steam, but and you can confirm or deny that.
No,
But
that's the plan. Yeah.
gotcha. Okay. So when do you think it would be like? Because inevitably there's going to be issues and things that crop up. When would be too long for you? Like what's the expiration? You're like, no, 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 we've got to ship this game. This has to be done.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm pretty confident that I will make sure to ship some sort of preview or beta this year. I think I'm not. See, it's different because the game doesn't have like when you have a game that's backed by investors or publishers or whatnot, the situation is completely different, right? Because you have to make
Hmm.
the money back that they poured into the project, which is obviously how it works in the industry at large. With a passion project like this, right, where it's evenings and weekends thing, and people just work on it on their free time, that part of it doesn't really exist. So it's obviously a lot more okay for dates to slip if you feel like that's what it takes. And as you say, they're having games that have taken 5 or even 10 years to get made for that exact reason.
Hmm.
But at the same time, yeah, if you get too comfortable with that, it might never get released. So to me, I think this year a beta or a public preview of some manner, I don't necessarily. I mean, the word beta doesn't really mean much in this day and age, at least not to the greater public.
Hmm.
Um, but definitely aiming for a harder date of like the end of this year for sure. I would be very surprised if the actual full release didn't happen in the next year. That seems very very unlikely because the thing is, the scope of this game is still fairly small, right? Like we have 11 story-driven levels. That's it. Right? There are no plans on multiplayer or anything like that for the initial release, right? Who knows what will happen after that? But the scope is still fairly small, so it's not. I don't think it's. I'm feeling reasonably comfortable on schedule right now.
Great. That's great. Yeah, because those are the things that always pop into my mind because I'm not really a developer, but I follow development and I'm curious about it and I listen and I know that there's so many different scenarios where you ha- it looks like Core Decay has been planned out on paper and you have all the details and just going through it's pretty much there.
is that is that the
It just
impression?
needs yeah, no, now it needs to just come into being, right? So
Yeah.
it seems like you have some kind of plan there, but hey, well, you have me fooled anyway. No,
Oh,
but
I'm just making it up as I go along.
no, honestly, you look at the website and everything that you've presented out into the public, and it looks very high end. You have all your social media ducks in a row, and there's enough to where you could dive in and get a little bit more information. What I'm interested in are the upgrades, the weapon upgrades, because that's what feels fun to me. That's what's interesting to me because I haven't played games like Deus Ex and System Shock. I know everybody is like, oh, really? Big surprise, Dumptruck hasn't played a game, but no, I just never came across. I've heard of them, I know of them, but those are the games I haven't jumped into. I'm more of kind of a fast action, basically a Quaker. I'm not a gamer, I'm a Quaker, but anyway, so can is there anything that excites you about the game that really isn't out there? Information isn't kind of obvious to everybody.
Well, as you say, the weapon upgrades haven't really been detailed a lot in general. In fact, speaking of making it up as you go along, I'm still nailing the design for that a particular feature. Um, I do think they'll prove interesting, but mainly, so the various systems in place to encourage replayability, I think they haven't really been shown that in depth, and that is namely the leveling system that exists in the game, which is like you get upgrades as you play the game and as you go through the levels when you defeat
Hmm.
enemies. And by the way, this entire thing is completely ripped out of one of the game difficulties because I know there are people who want more of an old school experience and they don't want any of that sort of stuff. They don't want randomized rewards. They don't want experience points or anything like that. So that's all. I got that covered. But
So is that like a casual mode then, or how?
I wouldn't say casual. I mean, it doesn't. So staying a little off topic, but it's an interesting topic. So basically, I've set the game up so that I have three difficulty levels. So one is the baseline normal difficulty, one is the harder one, and then one is the sort of retro one, which is more of its own thing.
Hmm.
So by default, you have a leveling system, whereas in which you defeat enemies, you gain experience, you level up, and when you level up, you get a cybernetic upgrade, and that could be anything from like you gain more health, you move faster, or every time you die, you explode, or you can see through walls, or like crazy stuff. Those are really exciting. Like they're really, really, I don't know. So it's actually kind of similar to say Here's Some Might and Magic, which is a weird comparison to make, I know, but um it's this idea of like you level up, and when you level up, you get a selection of randomized upgrades that have a certain chance, like the better, the rarer. And so it basically means that each playthrough is going to be a little bit different, and it's going to be a little bit different in how difficult it is. And since some people don't like that, like they don't really enjoy randomization like that, they want it to be purely skill driven. I'm adding on a difficult level, which is it's identical to the harder difficulty, except it just pulls any of that randomization out, right? Because I know that doesn't appeal to everyone, so I want to account for that. That being said, this system, when it is in, I personally really enjoy. It basically just means that every single time you play the game, you're gonna get like there are 100 of these upgrades, and you're gonna see maybe 20 at the very most throughout the playthrough. So you can play the game like 4 or 5 times, and you're gonna actually the gameplay is gonna differ quite a bit every single time. And again, it's something that it's a bit more of an RPG element to it, but I do think it works really well within the context of the existing systems in the game. So that's something that it hasn't really been done in this way before, and personally, I think it works, especially combined with the single player campaign, which you actually have. Um, it lets you choose which order you do certain levels in, so you can really get a totally different experience from one playthrough of the campaign to another. Which that to me is probably the most unique part of the game in that sense, and I think it works pretty well.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad I asked that question because that sounds really fascinating. The one challenge that I would say, just as a consumer of games, so it kind of reminds me of No Man's Sky, where you have to early on choose. Well, early on, like when you start the game, you have to choose whether you're going to do kind of a sandbox mode or the storyline or what have you, and that kind of locks you in unless they've changed that in the updates. That kind of locks you in. So one plea that I would have as a consumer is like, just make sure that's really clearly communicated. Like,
No, that's reasonable. Yeah.
If you're this type of gamer, this is probably what you will enjoy playing, or that kind of thing.
And I mean, I think it also helps that since the game isn't actually that long, we have 11 levels. That's it. 11 single player levels. You're kind of encouraged to play through multiple times. So even if you do opt for a difficulty, let you realize, okay, maybe this wasn't really what I had in mind, you can always, you can do multiple playthroughs, but you can also just start over, or you die, right? I mean, it's not like you do. I mean, we do have lives. You do run out of lives, and when you're not out of lives, you do want to start from scratch. But it's designed so that starting from scratch is fun and interesting, as opposed to being to feel like a chore, right?
Right. So now there was a lot of kind of retro style games and with pixel art and everything. How did you arrive at kind of the balance between, because if you blur your eyes, it looks kind of photoreal, but then as you get in closer, you've got some nice pixelization and nice pixels, I should say. And how did you arrive at that look? Was that something you iterated on, and you're like, or did you see something like, I kind of want to go in that direction, another game, or how did that arrive?
Yeah, I think so. I feel the main goal for me when establishing the aesthetic and the art style was essentially I wanted to make a game that looked like the way you remember these old games to look, more so than the way they actually look, right? Like I think most people have had that sort of thing where they remember a game from their childhood or their teenage years, and they remember the way it looked and it was awesome. And then you go back and play it, and it's like, oh, is it this pixelated? It's a thing. I think a lot of people have had that, and so my idea or my goal here was to basically feel like, okay, well, let's take that memory, let's take this idea of what these older games look like, and let's try to figure out how that would look. That's not to say these classic games in any means look bad. I mean, obviously they're great at what they do, but it's one direction. And I think that's guided me to some degree. I mean, practically speaking, what I do is mostly I have really simple textures, but I have more fidelity in the lighting. That's the main thing that I do. So I have very detailed lighting, but I have very simplistic or very low res textures, and I think that works as a combination. Aside from that, really, it's mostly just gut feeling and sort of iterating on it until I reached a point where, okay, I think this works pretty well. I did know early on I wanted to do this sort of industrial sci-fi Quake 2 style aesthetic, and I think it serves that pretty well.
Yeah, I agree. I think it has a beautiful look. I'm looking forward to playing the game for sure. Looks fantastic. One thing I will say is the visual effects look really nice as well. That's something that jumped out at me when I was watching the trailer, because I've watched the trailer about 4 times now, and it's overall just a really nice level of polish, and the brights are bright and the darks are dark, right? So
Well, I'm glad you
really,
like it. Yeah,
very
the
cool.
color is, I mean, the color is important because, you look at games from like 2009, that general era, and, the idea of realism was brown, and that was generally all you had. And I feel like we're kind of moving back to this idea that, well, yeah, it can be brown and desaturated, but you have to have touches of color. Otherwise, it just looks drab and uninteresting. So something like the weapons, I make sure that they're not just brown chunks. They have like, they have some color to them, general lighting, general atmospheric effects. I think, yeah, I don't want it to be completely gray and desaturated. And, it definitely, it's nice when it pops.
Yeah, I was going to say that the weapons definitely pop for me. So you took the words right out of my mouth. Well, I will say that moving on from Core Decay, I've read your bio, and it said you enjoy the outdoors and reading and photography, but you also say cooking. So now you're from Sweden. You're from Sweden. So did you bring any Swedish recipes over to the States when you moved here?
I did, yes.
So do tell. What's your favorite Swedish dish?
Well, I will say that the the traditional Swedish Christmas food is its own kind of thing, and that's something that I try as hard as possible to emulate here in the States, and it's not always easy. But there are a lot of unique Christmas foods specifically that is really really hard to make here, like things that involve things like blackcurrant juice, which is almost impossible to find.
This sounds like a potion in one of your games.
Exactly. So there are a few things like that unique beverages, unique. Some of it's really hard to find, and I try my best every year to sort of mimic that. But it's worked reasonably well so far.
And does your wife like your cooking?
Yes.
Oh, good. Yeah, she's a lucky lady because my wife, I can boil water and microwave things and make peanut butter and jelly. Did I lose you?
Oh, sorry. No, I hear.
Oh, okay. Okay, it just wasn't very funny. Well, hey, listen, it's been a real pleasure chatting with you about Core Decay. I'm really looking forward to it. I've wish listed, and I just joined your Discord this morning, so I'll be following things. And a real pleasure to have you on. And we will have you back when you get closer to your release. You're welcome anytime. So reach out. If I don't reach out to you, feel free to reach out to me, and we'll get you on the show.
Thank you so much. And I do want to give a shout out to my team and everyone who helped me working on this game. In particular, Serge, who is fantastic. He's doing an amazing job, and I'm really, really happy to have him on board. But everyone else involved as well. I'm really, really excited to see where we all can take this together and bring it to life.
That's it for this episode of the Quakecast. Thank you so much for hanging in there and listening up to this very last moment. Take care of yourself, everyone. We'll see you. I have a few more episodes recorded. We just have to get those edited, and they'll be rolling out some good stuff. And there will be a return of Greenwood's Vanilla Scoops very soon. Have a good one.